February 1959. High in the frozen wilderness of the northern Ural Mountains, a group of 9 experienced hikers makes a decision that defies every instinct of human survival. In the middle of a lethal Siberian winter, they cut their own tent open from the inside and flee into the darkness. Their boots remain behind. Their coats remain behind. Their shelter remains behind. Weeks later, rescuers will find their bodies scattered across the mountain, some frozen, some gravely injured, all victims of a night no one can fully explain. For more than 60 years, the Dyatlov Pass Incident has lived somewhere between science and speculation, between physics and folklore. Tonight, we reopen the file. Welcome to Deep Dive Dossier, Case File 004.
Picture this. It's February 1959. You're standing on the freezing, desolate slopes of Kolotchak. It's deep in the northern Ural Mountains.
The Mountain of the Dead.
Right, the Mountain of the Dead. The temperature is plummeting past minus 30 degrees Celsius. The wind is howling, absolute darkness. And somewhere on this pitch-black, windswept slope, a group of 9 highly experienced hikers has just taken a knife, sliced their own tent open from the inside, and fled into the lethal cold.
Leaving everything behind.
Leaving everything, their boots, their winter coats, their survival gear, none of them would ever be seen alive again.
It's a scene that defies every instinct of human survival. I mean, these were not amateurs. They were seasoned mountaineers who understood that running into a Siberian winter storm without gear was an automatic death sentence.
Which means something terrified them so completely that the freezing abyss of the mountains seemed like the safer option.
Welcome to Case File 004 of Deep Dive Dossier. Today we are bringing you our third investigator into the chilling mystery of the Dyatlov Pass Incident. A case that has baffled the world for over 60 years.
Over 60 years of wild theories. But our mission today is different. We are not relying on internet speculation. For this deep dive, we are opening a newly curated dossier. We are using AI-assisted analysis to run historical logs through modern predictive models.
We're talking cross-referencing scientific studies, terrain mapping, forensic reports,
Declassified Soviet documents. We are using AI tools to synthesize all this data to finally find the truth.
and the value of this approach really cannot be overstated. For decades, researchers were looking at this case with the limited investigative tools of 1959. Today, modern scientific instruments like digital topographic modeling and advanced medical science allow us to revisit this cold case with fresh eyes. By letting these analytical tools map the variables, we can separate the physical evidence from the folklore.
Okay, let's unpack this. We need to establish the known timeline, fact from fiction. January 1959. Igor Dyatlov leads a group of 10 on a grueling Category 3 winter trek.
The highest difficulty rating.
Yeah. But one hiker turns back early. Yuri Yudin. He gets sciatica, which is just a massive twist of fate that literally saves his life. So the remaining 9 press on, they drift slightly off course, and on February 1st, they pitch their tent on an exposed slope.
And they never return.
They never return. Weeks later, search parties finally find the campsite, and what they find is just chilling.
It completely upended their expectations. The tent was half-buried in snow, but crucially, it had not been swept away. It wasn't crushed by some massive, chaotic avalanche.
And it was slashed open.
Yes. Forensics quickly confirmed through a seamstress's analysis that the cuts were made from the inside. They literally cut their way out of their own shelter.
So outside the tent, the footprints tell a completely contradictory story. You'd think, okay, they slashed the tent, they're running in a blind panic.
Right.
But no, the tracks show a calm, measured walking pace leading down the slope toward the tree line. Some prints show people wearing only a single sock. Some are completely barefoot. 9 sets of tracks, walking shoulder to shoulder.
What's fascinating here is the sheer cognitive dissonance of that scene. A desperate, destructive exit from the tent, followed immediately by an orderly, measured march to certain death.
It makes no sense.
It doesn't. But it is vital to note that our AI-synthesized reports of the search party logs confirm a critical detail. There were absolutely no other footprints found anywhere on that slope.
No signs of a struggle.
No foreign tracks at all.
Yeah.
That firmly rules out an immediate physical attack by outsiders or the indigenous Mansi people. The group was entirely alone on that mountain.
So what does this all mean? About a mile down the slope, under a large cedar tree, the searchers find the first two bodies, and they're in just their underwear.
Next to the remains of a small improvised fire.
Yeah, and one hiker has actually bitten off a piece of his own knuckle. Just terrifying. Then, 3 more bodies are found, spaced out on the slope, including Dyatlov himself. They're frozen in poses, suggesting they were desperately crawling back up toward the tent.
Most died of hypothermia, but one had a fractured skull. And we know from the dossier that their watches were stopped at 5:31 a.m. and 8:45 a.m.
Which tells us they survived out there in the freezing darkness for hours.
Hours of fighting to stay alive. They were cutting branches, building a fire, climbing a tree to likely look for the tent. They even respectfully took clothes from the first 2 who succumbed to the cold, attempting to insulate themselves.
It wasn't madness, it was a methodical survival effort.
Exactly.
But the real shock comes 2 months later. It's May, the spring thaw finally hits, and they find the final 4 hikers buried under 4 meters of snow in a ravine.
They had built a makeshift den.
Yeah, a den out of cut branches. But the trauma these 4 sustained is, well, it's inexplicable. One has a severely fractured skull, splintered in multiple places. 2 others, Ludmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov, have massive symmetrical rib fractures.
I'm looking at the AI analysis of the 1959 autopsy notes right now. The official Soviet medical examiner, Boris Vozdeny, was very clear. He explicitly stated the force required to break bones like that was equivalent to a high-speed car crash.
A car crash on a mountain.
Right. But the defining anomaly of the Dyatlov Pass incident, the thing that birthed the 1,000 conspiracy theories, is that there was no external soft tissue damage.
No bruises.
None. No bruises, no scrapes, no abrasions that matched the severity of those broken bones.
How do you crush someone's chest with the force of a car crash without leaving a single bruise? And to cap it all off, 2 of the ravine victims were missing their eyes, 1 was missing her tongue, and traces of radioactivity were found on some of their clothing.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you basically have a locked room mystery on the side of a mountain. A slashed tent, radioactive traces, missing organs, and devastating blunt force injuries with no external bruising.
All without a single footprint from an attacker.
It is entirely understandable why the Soviet investigators eventually just threw their hands up, blamed an unknown compelling natural force, and sealed the archives.
Yeah, they just gave up. But they didn't have the sophisticated modeling we do today. This is why we are using AI to comb through this dossier. Let's look at what the modern scientific studies reveal, starting with the avalanche theory.
The most heavily debated theory.
Right. For decades, experts said an avalanche was flat out impossible here. Skeptics pointed out that the slope was only about 22 to 28 degrees. That's too flat for an avalanche.
Plus, there was no fresh snowfall that night.
Exactly. And most importantly, there was a massive 9-hour gap between when the hikers cut into the snow to pitch their tent and whatever disaster struck them. Avalanches don't just hang in midair for 9 hours waiting to fall.
That was the conventional wisdom, yes.
Nah.
But the AI models highlight a breakthrough 2021 study by researchers Alexander Puzrin from ETH Zurich and Johann Gahm from EPFL in Switzerland. They systematically dismantled those old assumptions using modern science.
Starting with the slope.
First, the slope topography. Digital terrain modeling proved that while the average slope seemed gentle, the local topography immediately above the tent featured a hidden step in the terrain.
Like a ledge.
Exactly. This made the specific slope directly above them steeper than 28 degrees, which actually crosses the critical mathematical threshold for a slab avalanche.
Okay, but it wasn't snowing that night. That's always been a massive sticking point. Where did the snow come from?
The environment provided something much more dangerous than falling snow. Katabatic winds.
Katabatic winds. I saw that in the weather reconstruction.
Yes. These are incredibly dense, heavy, freezing air masses that flow downhill like a fluid river. Because cold air is heavier than warm air, as it cools on the peaks, gravity pulls it down the slope. It accelerates, acting like a localized, invisible snowplow.
So it's moving the existing snow.
All night long. These winds acted like a conveyor belt, continuously carrying massive amounts of hard, packed snow and dumping it precisely onto the ledge above the tent, right where the hikers had made a deep cut into the snowpack to pitch their shelter.
They unknowingly destabilized their own foundation.
Precisely. The wind spent the next 9 hours quietly loading a deadly compounding weight right above their heads.
Okay, here's where the dossier gets really interesting. To prove this specific scenario could actually cause those exact car crash injuries, the researchers went somewhere completely unexpected. Disney. Literally, Walt Disney Animation Studios.
It sounds absurd at first.
It does. The researcher, Johann Gaum, saw the movie Frozen and was so impressed by the realistic physics of the snow animation that he traveled to Hollywood to get the code.
Wait, so you're telling me Elsa's snow magic helped solve a cold case?
As bizarre as it sounds, yes. The animation code provided the missing link. It's a brilliant application of cross-disciplinary science. Disney animators used something called the material point method to simulate how individual snow particles fracture, compress, and collide.
Because animating snow is notoriously difficult.
Very difficult. Gaum took that advanced snow simulation software and combined it with biomechanical data from the 1970s.
The General Motors car crash test data. Yes. Back in the 70s, before crash test dummies were perfected with modern sensors, researchers used actual human cadavers to measure blunt force trauma.
Right, because they needed to know exactly how bones break.
They documented exactly how much velocity and mass it takes to break human ribs and craniums at various pressures. By feeding the Disney snow physics and the GM cadaver data into their simulation, they could test the exact impact of the snow on the human body.
And the results from our AI analysis of the simulation are absolutely staggering. It wasn't a giant roaring wall of fluffy snow that hit them. It was a slab avalanche.
A very specific type of avalanche.
A small, dense, rock-hard block of icy snow, maybe 5 meters long, about the size and weight of an SUV. So around midnight, the snowpack finally snapped. This massive block of ice slid silently down the slope and directly onto the tent.
And the simulation solved the mystery of the bruising.
Yes. Unpack that for us, because that's the part that always felt paranormal.
It comes down to what was underneath them. To insulate themselves from the freezing ground, the hikers had laid their stiff wooden skis underneath the floor of the tent. When this incredibly heavy, hard slab of snow dropped onto them in their sleep, they were crushed between two rigid surfaces, the ice block above and the skis below.
So the skis acted like an anvil.
Exactly. The models proved this specific, localized impact generates immense internal pressure, snapping ribs and fracturing skulls, while distributing the force widely enough across the surface area of the body that it doesn't leave localized external bruising.
It perfectly matches Vozrozhdeni's autopsy reports. So picture this. They're suddenly crushed in the pitch dark. They're severely injured. They can't breathe. They think the entire mountain is coming down on them. Panic sets in. Someone grabs a knife, slashes the tent, and they drag their critically injured friends out into the storm.
And because they think another massive avalanche is seconds away, they don't dig for boots or coats. They just run for the tree line.
This raises an important question, though. The avalanche explains the blunt force trauma and the slashed tent. But how do the medical and environmental models in the dossier explain the other anomalies?
You mean the behavior at the tree line?
Right. The bizarre state of undress at the cedar tree, the hikers burying themselves in a den. I was just looking at the medical science section of our AI synthesis. You see these photos of 2 hikers found under the cedar tree in their underwear, and it's incredibly eerie. People love to point to this as evidence of madness or some hallucinogenic, panic-inducing weapon.
That's a very common internet theory. But there's a robust physiological explanation for this. It's a well-documented medical phenomenon called paradoxical undressing. We cross-referenced case reports regarding severe terminal hypothermia.
Terminal hypothermia, so the very end stages.
Yes. In the final, lethal stages of freezing to death, the human brain's thermal regulation system completely breaks down. For hours, your body has been aggressively constricting blood vessels in your extremities to keep your core organs warm. But as the energy fails, those muscles get out. Suddenly, a rush of warm blood from the core floods back out to the freezing skin.
And their brain misinterprets that signal.
Completely. The victims, already severely disoriented and suffering from hypoxemia, experience a massive hot flash. They physically feel like they are burning alive. In their delirium, they tear off their clothes in the freezing snow, just moments before cardiovascular collapse.
That is tragic. And what about the hikers in the ravine digging that den? They were found huddled in a snow cave they built out of cedar branches.
That ties into another physiological response called terminal burrowing, or hide and die syndrome. It's a primitive brainstem reaction triggered in the final throes of hypothermia. As the higher cognitive functions shut down, the brain reverts to evolutionary survival instincts, causing victims to dig into small, enclosed spaces.
Much like hibernating animals.
Exactly. They weren't hiding from a monster or a military hit squad. They were acting on pure, desperate physiological instinct as their brains shut down.
Okay, but we have to address the most sensationalized details of the case. The missing tongue and eyes of the ravine victims. When you read that in an article, it sounds like the work of a serial killer. or the military silencing witnesses.
It sounds horrific, certainly, but the taphonomic analysis provides a grimmer, yet entirely natural reality.
Taphonomy being the study of how organisms decay.
Correct. The dossier lays the environmental timeline out clearly. These 4 bodies weren't found in February with the others. They were found in May. They were buried under 4 meters of snow, resting at the bottom of a ravine in a flowing meltwater stream bed.
So they were in water for months.
Flowing water. When a human body is exposed to running water and natural elements for 3 months, the softest tissues decay first. The eyes and the tongue are incredibly delicate. Add in the high probability of small scavenging animals finding the bodies during the spring thaw, and the missing soft tissue is completely consistent with natural post-mortem decomposition in that specific wet environment.
It's not a monster. It's nature.
It is a stark reminder that nature is indifferent. The environment itself erased the evidence and created anomalies that looked, to the untrained eye, entirely malicious.
But what about the radiation? You can't just explain away radioactive clothing with snow and wind. This is where the alternative theories really dig their heels in. Bloggers and amateur sleuths point to the radiation and claim it's definitive proof of a Soviet weapons test or a secret missile strike.
We must evaluate these alternative theories critically against the established facts in the dossier. Regarding the missile theory, no debris, no chemical repellent residue, and no verifiable impact craters were ever found by the extensive Soviet search teams.
Teams that included military personnel.
Personnel who knew exactly what a missile strike site looked like. However, the radiation on the clothing is a factual finding in the official case file.
So how does our AI data analysis explain nuclear traces on a remote hiking trail?
It comes down to the individual histories of the hikers themselves. Several members of the Dyatlov group were engineering students, and some, like Krivonechenko, had previously been employed at the Mayak facility.
The site of the Kishtim disaster?
Exactly. In 1957, the Mayak plutonium production plant experienced the 3rd most serious nuclear accident in history. Some of these hikers actually worked in the cleanup efforts.
Oh, wow.
In the late 1950s Soviet Union, decontamination protocols were rudimentary at best. Heavy winter hiking gear is difficult to clean, and radioactive isotopes easily settled deep into wool and canvas fibers. The traces found on their clothing were a haunting remnant of their prior professional exposure to a nuclear disaster, not evidence of a secret weapon deployed on the mountain.
That makes so much sense when you look at their backgrounds. Let's look at another theory that gets a lot of traction. Infrasound. I've seen a very popular hypothesis suggesting the wind whipping over the dome of the mountain created something called a Karman vortex street.
A well-documented meteorological phenomenon.
Right. For those who aren't meteorologists, the theory is that when intense wind hits a blunt object, like a mountain peak, it doesn't just flow smoothly over it. It shears off in alternating, swirling vortices. And these spinning vortices can literally create low-frequency sound waves. Infrasound around 18 or 19 hertz is actually the resonant frequency of the human eyeball,
which can cause visual hallucinations, feelings of intense dread, and nausea.
So the theory is that the mountain itself drove them insane with sound.
The infrasound theory is scientifically fascinating and meteorologically possible in that region. However, as an explanation for the Dyatlov incident, it completely fails when tested against the physical evidence in our dossier.
Because of the injuries.
Exactly. Even if we grant that a Karman vortex street induced a panic attack that caused them to flee the tent, it fails to account for the massive blunt force trauma. Infrasound does not crush ribs or fracture skulls with the force of an SUV crash. It doesn't explain the slashed tent, and it certainly doesn't account for the organized, measured footsteps walking away from the camp.
And lastly, the Hollywood favorites. Aliens or the Russian Yeti. I know as investigators we shouldn't even validate it, but it's part of the lore.
We can dismiss these simply by returning to the primary source documents. The site was pristine in terms of tracks. There were 9 sets of human footprints leaving the tent. No massive anomalous prints, no landing gear indentations, no foreign tracks of any kind. An attack by a physical being, terrestrial or otherwise, would leave a physical imprint in deep settling snow.
So let's step back and look at the whole picture. We've run the facts of Case File 004 through modern science, biomechanical models, taphonomy, and historical data synthesis. So what is our verdict?
The AI-assisted analysis strongly points to a perfect storm of environmental and physical factors. The group pitched their tent on a precarious, localized, steep slope. Katabatic winds acted as a conveyor belt, loading a massive amount of snow onto a fragile, compromised foundation over 9 continuous hours.
And then the slab avalanche.
A localized slab avalanche, dense and heavy as concrete, slid and crushed the tent, inflicting severe trauma on several members because of the rigid skis beneath them.
Driven from the tent in sheer terror, feeling a larger secondary avalanche was imminent, they fled into the darkness without their gear. They ultimately succumbed to extreme hypothermia, leading to the bizarre behaviors of paradoxical undressing and terminal burrowing.
And the spring thaw, combined with the flowing stream and natural scavengers, created the gruesome state of the bodies found in the ravine months later. Stripping away the decades of folklore, the mystery appears largely explained by brutal, unforgiving science.
It does. But we must also acknowledge the profound human element woven into this data. The evidence shows that even in the pitch dark, suffering from catastrophic injuries and freezing to death, they did not abandon each other.
They didn't scatter.
No. They built a fire, they tried to build a shelter, they respectfully gave the clothes off their own frozen backs to try and save their friends. It was a heroic, desperate struggle for survival against insurmountable odds.
That is the crucial takeaway. We can model the avalanche with pinpoint accuracy using Disney software and crash data, but we cannot model the human spirit in its final moments.
That's the part that really sticks with you. Science can perfectly explain the mechanics of the snow block and the medical reasons their hearts finally stopped. But we will never know exactly what conversations were had in that pitch-black tent as the snow crushed down on them. We will never know the exact sequence of heroic choices they made as they carried their broken friends down that mountain in the dark.
We have the what and the how, but the personal experience of that night remains with them.
Well said. The evidence is in. The dossier is complete, but some case files never close completely.
Until next time, keep questioning the evidence.
In the end, the Dyatlov Pass Incident may not belong to the realm of monsters, conspiracies, or supernatural forces. It may belong to something far more indifferent: nature, physics, and a fragile layer of snow hidden beneath the surface of a frozen mountain. Modern science can model the avalanche. Medicine can explain the strange behavior of hypothermia. Forensics can reconstruct the final hours of those 9 hikers. But there is one detail that will always remain beyond the reach of analysis: what it felt like to stand on that mountain, in the dark, knowing the storm was closing in. The evidence is in, the dossier is complete,